It is one of the most fascinating questions in European history. In June of 1815, on the muddy fields of Belgium, Napoleon Bonaparte faced off against a coalition army led by Britain's Duke of Wellington and Prussia's Field Marshal Blücher. The battle that followed became legendary, not only for its scale but for its consequences. Napoleon's defeat ended his reign, reshaped Europe, and marked the start of a new era of balance between great powers. But if the outcome had been reversed, if Napoleon had triumphed, then the history of the modern world might look entirely different. To imagine this alternate timeline, we first need to understand Napoleon's situation on the eve of the battle. After escaping exile on the island of Elba, Napoleon returned to France and quickly rallied the nation. His charisma, military genius, and promise of renewed glory gave him the support he needed to march once again. Yet, he knew his time was limited. The Allied powers, Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, were determined to crush him. Napoleon's only chance was to strike fast, defeat the coalition armies in detail before they could fully unite, and then negotiate peace from a position of strength. Waterloo was his gamble to preserve his empire. Now, imagine the battle went differently. Suppose Napoleon's initial assaults had broken Wellington's lines before the Prussians could arrive. Suppose his cavalry charges had not been repelled, and the Imperial Guard, the elite of his army, had smashed through instead of retreating. The battlefield would have ended with Napoleon still standing, his enemies scattered, and the French tricolor waving over a decisive victory. The immediate consequence of such a triumph would have been political shock across Europe. Britain and Prussia had staked everything on defeating Napoleon that day. With their armies shattered, France would suddenly hold the advantage. Austria and Russia, who were still far away, might have hesitated to throw more men into the fight after such a disaster. Napoleon, ever the strategist, would not necessarily have needed to invade Britain or Russia again. Instead, he could have used this victory to force the great powers into a negotiated peace, one that recognized him as ruler of France, and possibly restored his control over territories lost after his earlier defeats. But the impact of Waterloo would have gone beyond politics. A victorious Napoleon could have reshaped the entire 19th century. His rule was not just about conquest, it was about ideas. Wherever he went, Napoleon carried with him the Napoleonic Code, a system of laws that abolished feudal privilege, promoted merit, and modernized administration. If he had remained on the throne, these reforms might have spread even further across Europe, accelerating the decline of monarchies and strengthening secular centralized governments decades earlier than they did in our timeline. Economically, France under Napoleon might have built a stronger continental system. His plan to weaken Britain by creating a unified European market closed to British goods. Had he won at Waterloo, this system could have been reinforced, potentially delaying Britain's rise as the dominant global power of the 19th century. Europe's industrial development might have taken a different path, with France leading the way instead of Britain. Colonial empires, too, might have shifted. A stronger France could have challenged Britain's dominance overseas, possibly reshaping the balance of power in India, Africa, and the Caribbean. Culturally, Napoleon's victory would have deepened the spread of revolutionary ideals. His empire promoted equality before the law, secular education, and the idea of nations rather than dynasties ruling Europe. If he had lived longer on the throne, we might have seen the unification of countries like Germany or Italy happen under French influence rather than through wars led by Prussia decades later. Europe's map, instead of being redrawn by the Congress of Vienna, could have remained centered on a powerful French-led order. Yet a longer Napoleonic era would not have been without challenges. His empire already faced strains of nationalism. In Spain, guerrilla resistance had drained French resources for years. In Germany, Poland, and Italy, people both admired and resisted him. A longer reign might have amplified these tensions, with independence movements rising across the empire. Napoleon's genius lay in his ability to adapt quickly, but even he would have struggled to control a continent filled with diverse languages, cultures, and ambitions. Still, his presence would have altered the pace of history. In our timeline, after Waterloo, the great powers gathered at the Congress of Vienna and established a conservative order that kept peace in Europe for nearly a century. Monarchies were restored, revolutions were suppressed, and balance of power became the guiding principle. If Napoleon had won, that conservative era might never have come. Instead of the age of Metternich, we might have seen an age of Napoleonic dominance, with revolutionary ideas continuing to spread unchecked. Europe could have entered the modern world decades sooner. The ripple effects would have reached beyond Europe as well. In the Americas, independence movements were already underway in places like Latin America. Napoleon's survival might have encouraged or reshaped these revolutions, either through French support or through the weakening of Britain's ability to project power overseas. The United States, too, might have faced a different balance of power in the Atlantic if Napoleon had remained the central figure of European politics. And then there is the personal element. Napoleon was not yet 50 at the time of Waterloo. A man of enormous energy and ambition, he could easily have ruled for another 2 decades had he succeeded. His legacy might have shifted from that of a brilliant but fallen emperor to a long-reigning architect of a new European order. The legends of Waterloo, of exile on St. Helena, of his final downfall would never have been written. Instead, the 19th century might have been remembered as the Age of Napoleon. In the end, the defeat at Waterloo sealed his fate and defined the path of history as we know it. Britain rose to global dominance, the balance of power stabilized Europe, and the Industrial Revolution spread under the framework established by the victors of 1815. But the idea of Napoleon victorious reminds us how fragile turning points can be. A single battle, a single afternoon of rain-soaked fields and desperate charges changed the world forever. So what if Napoleon had won at Waterloo? Europe might have been unified under his rule. Monarchies might have fallen sooner, and the modern world might have taken shape decades earlier. Instead, the guns fell silent with his defeat, and the dream of a Napoleonic century was buried beneath the mud of Waterloo.